common consensus seems to be that figure painting is scary. I don't think it has to be, and I think it can even be pretty straightforward to get decent results. Let's test that theory today. I'm using a Miniart Civilian with a resin head and an 8th Army officer's cap to represent a Free State driver in 1922. If he looks messy, it's because I had previously painted this figure, but decided to strip the paint off and repaint him for this project. The figure wasn't particularly good. Miniart's figure subjects are often let down by the soft details, but we'll see what we can make of him today. As always, I start with priming. I spray black all over, although a rattle can will do the same job if you don't want to use an airbrush. We're looking for complete coverage with this dark colour, so anywhere we miss with the brush later on will simply look like shadows. I'll be using brushes for the rest of the video, starting with this waistcoat for an early, easy win. I start by running an edge highlight down the centre seam in a nice bright grey, before pulling more highlights along the folds in the fabric on each side. I'm applying the paint nice and thin, which lets it blend a bit nicer and creates more of a gradient. I don't worry too much about the areas which are covered by our jacket or obscured by details like the hand. We're just blocking in our main tone here. Speaking of blocking in tones, I then followed up with white acrylic on the collar of his shirt and his cuffs. This is where the sculpt isn't doing us any favours because some of the seams and the edges are really quite vague, so we just need to make decisions here with the paint. With white out, I mix it with some of the grey from the waistcoat and I repeat our highlighting steps from before over slightly less area. I'm keeping everything nice and sketchy, including a few vertical lines down the waistcoat, which maybe represent some kind of pinstripe or something similar. I also decided to give him a nice bright blue on his tie to add a pop of colour. This is especially poorly defined on this figure, so we really have a bit of free will to decide its shape. I added a drop of lighter and darker flesh tone to the palette, and I used the darker one to base coat all of the exposed skin on this figure. While I'm doing that, you may be wondering why this army driver is wearing a 3-piece suit. At the start of the Civil War, the National Army was lacking trained drivers, so they hired civilian drivers on a temporary basis to operate vehicles such as my armoured tender. These drivers are often seen in their everyday clothes and period photographs, often just with a National Army cap to identify them. We're going around the figure now with this darker tone to set us up for some easy but vibrant skin in the end. I've tried a few different ways of painting flesh in the past, from bright base coats, washes, and even speed paints, but I think this technique is the most reliable way I've found at the moment. Once we've hit all the skin with the dark tones, we can come back with the brighter one and begin painting our main paint layer. This will be the colour that the figure should read as in the end, and I'm applying this paint on top of all details such as fingers and then about 75% of the rest of the skin surface. We get a really nice vibrancy on this paint thanks to our tanned undercoat. For many people, I think the face is the truly scary part. I start by painting our flesh over the T of the nose and forehead before dragging paint from the nose along the cheekbone. Autofocus wasn't my friend here, but I hope you can see how I just necklace the raised areas on the face with the brighter paint and I leave the recesses in the tanned tone. I'm blending the paint with water here so that we get a gradient from top to bottom of the cheek, with the upper surfaces on the face being the brightest. I then thinned down a very dark red until it was practically water, and I painted it around important seams and into details like the mouth and the eyes. The acrylic is a much heavier paint than an oil or an enamel, for example, so we have more opportunity to control where this paint will end up. Speaking of enamel washes, I decided to step away from the skin for the minute and add a pin wash to the waistcoat. This should help to reset our eyes a bit, so we can more objectively assess how the skin areas look. As always, this effect was cleaned away from unwanted areas with some white spirits. Okay, now for the scary part. I got the figure into a fairly stable position on the desk, and I attempted to paint in the whites of his eyes. I'm barely touching the brush off of the model here, and I'm dragging it in a line. This should help to avoid big blobs in the eye sockets. With the white out, I also touched up our shirt. Again, I apologise for the focus. I use a dark brown paint to dot in the eyes themselves. Black can be very overwhelming for this purpose. I think a brown is a bit more subtle. My number one top tip to avoid cross eyes is to make the figure look somewhere. The margin of error is much wider with eyes looking to the sides, so whenever you have that option, take it. Now with some white mixed into our flesh tone, we add a few more highlights on the face and on the hands. This step can double as damage control to fix any mistakes we made on the eyes too. This gives us quite a stylized effect, but we're not quite done yet, and the strong contrast jumps will really help this guy to stand out on the shelf or on a table. Here you can see that I'm just using a mix of the colours on our palette, like the dark red and flesh, to just clean up any of the slightly messier areas on the surface. With some of that stressful detail work out of the way, we can move on to the larger base coating areas on the rest of the figure. I wasn't a massive fan of the grey everything, so I decided to go for more of a brown suit. Here again we're doing a semi-base coat, we're just painting the larger areas, but leaving a lot of the recesses in the dark grey black colour to add a bit more depth to the fabric. In larger areas I'm practically just glazing the brown on top of the surface, just to vary the colour before adding more opacity on the upper areas. Same goes for the trousers here. I'll happily admit that I had a screenshot of the final shootout from season 1 of Peaky Blinders on the screen here to help me get some inspiration for the 1920s fashion and the colour tones. With a bit of grey and buff mixed in, I once again started with some scratchy edge highlights and blended highlights. By tapping and stippling another highlight on top of this one, we can suggest some kind of wool material on this suit. The same colour also works as a final highlight on fabric folds and edges. This is certainly a different style of painting to what we'd usually do on an armour model, but I'm sure you can see that we're not actually doing anything particularly difficult or challenging here. While we're painting this suit, let me just give some context to this figure. I chose not to get a beautiful resin cast figure with exquisite detail in this case because I simply didn't see the need. I wanted a figure to give scale and setting to the model. I've painted a lot of figures in my past and I know the process and level of polish that I'm happy with to create a supporting figure for dioramas or vignettes. The total recording time for the raw footage of painting this figure came out at 1 hour and 13 minutes. So let me know if you think this is a worthwhile time investment in your view. For our cap, I started with this super saturated green. It ended up being a bit much, but that's easily fixed with another layer of paint. I used a different green that I was happier with, and was able to blend the two together to create highlights and shadows directly on the model while they were still wet. The cap then got a highlight with olive drab to wrap things up. With some gold and silver mixed like in the last video, I added his cap badge and the detail that runs along the top of the brim. Maybe the image of Arthur Shelby on the monitor affected me a bit more than I realised because I decided to add a good strong moustache on this guy, which inadvertently had him looking a bit like James Connolly. With the brown out, I gave the goggles some attention too. A nice orange-brown highlight helped to sell this part as leather, and it differentiates it from the rest of the fairly drab suit. The strap got a passive yellow ochre tone here too, just to pick it out from the lapel and the collar. Into the final stretch on this figure now, and I gave the cap a dark brown pin wash to separate the details and to define the seam between the gold and the brown. This works on some select areas of the suit too, like cuffs, buttons and seams. Cleaned up with white spirits, this does a good job of showing off the few crisp details that do exist on this Miniart sculpt. A final spray with AK's Ultra Matte Varnish, and this guy was ready for our final display. A display we'll be making in the next and final video in the Lancia series. So make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss the finale of this project. In the meantime, please leave a comment and a like, and let me know what you think about how this figure turned out. I think these photographs give a much better impression of how he actually looks. The sharpening effect on the video camera often exaggerates how messy some of the highlight and the paintwork can look. But I think that's exactly the point of what we're doing today. It's amazing how sketchy, quick steps can build up to quite a presentable final effect. He won't be winning any awards in painting competitions, but I think he's perfectly fine to stand next to our vehicle. I even painted this guy so quick, I forgot to paint his shoes until it came time to take the photos at the end. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.